Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it very much. All right, I'm ready for the next slide. I think my very first Esoterica public lecture was during the holiday season several years ago, when the topic was magic mushrooms and flying reindeer. Anybody remember that presentation? In my humble opinion, you need to bring that back next year. That was a great topic. I hope a couple years from now somebody talks about me, but I doubt it, because that was very memorable. So I appreciate that. I also had the opportunity to be your first COVID quarterly speaker, where we were all trying to figure out how that Zoom meeting thing worked. That was only a couple years ago, and yet it seems like forever. And hopefully tonight will be a little different, a little better than that. Next slide, please. So I'm willing to state that I understand more about geometry, the theory and history of geometry, the development of mathematics and geometry in Western culture, better than at least 90% of the people in the room. And I only say that because I am also willing to admit that 90% or more of you know more about philosophy than I do. So tonight's journey will be a partnership. I will take the lead as we roar through geometry, and then I expect you to help pick up the assistance when we move into the field of philosophy. So let's make this cooperative, and let's try to do this together. Next slide, please. So if we're going to talk about philosophy, Plato, along with his teacher Socrates, and his student Aristotle, are the foundation of Western philosophy and religion, and therefore are the logical place to start. And here are two quotes. The first one being, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." And supposedly that was across the top of the academy that Plato had. And the other one being, "Geometry will draw the mind toward truth and create the spirit of philosophy." Plato believed that geometry, which of course is the geometry of a straight edge and compasses along with the 5 Platonic solids, was the key to understanding the universe. And so we will start our journey to find the connection between philosophy and modern sacred geometry in the ancient world. Next slide, please. So sacred geometry is actually a fairly modern term. It came into general use in about the 1950s. And if you look on Google, where you can search words in books and whatnot, it's becoming more and more popular all the time. There are many people who write articles about how Pythagoras and Plato taught sacred geometry, but I think saying that's actually fairly intellectually lazy, and we'll work our way through that tonight. But however we define sacred geometry in the 21st century, it's not at all what the ancient mystery schools taught or thought when they talked about geometry. Now, if you think about the works of Homer, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, they've stood up fairly well over the past 3,000+ years, because the human condition really is not significantly different than it was at that time. But you cannot say the same about numbers, mathematics, or geometry. Next slide, please. So if we're going to try and enter Plato's academy, he would actually consider us, I think, as ignorant. So let's see if we can figure out why I believe he would think we're ignorant, and see if we can get rid of a little of that and manage to get ourselves into the academy. Next slide, please. We're going to start with numbers, and then we'll move to geometry. So this is the Greek numerical system. All of our ancient mystery schools taught mathematics using a numerical system obviously significantly different than the one we use today. Now, this type of a numerical system works fine in a pre-industrial civilization, because it supports functions like taxes and census and trade, but it's not very helpful. It's not very useful. I can tell at least some of you are the same age I am, and when we were in school first learning multiplication, we learned multiplication tables because the process of hand doing multiplication over and over was tedious, and so they were put onto tables. Well, those tables go clear back to the Babylonians, if not before, because having a number system like this makes mathematics extremely cumbersome. You only want to do it once. And so they were huge advocates for building these tables, which would help them with their mathematics. So, no zeros, no algebra, no decimal points, no fractions, everything's whole numbers. And of course, we would move on to the much more user-friendly Roman numeral system as soon as we could. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about what geometry was like to the ancient Greeks. This is a sample of Euclid's Elements. It's also obviously very different than what our 21st century experience has. That's why I would say we are ignorant of what geometry meant to Plato. This is geometry with a straight edge and a compass, no trigonometry, no algebra, no formulas. If you look at that proof, there's no a squared plus b squared plus c squared. And there are in these the idea of the use of a ratio. Now we use the same notations for ratio and fractions, but in fact for the Greeks they didn't even think of the concept of fractions. It was all about ratios. Next slide, please. So when you get a mathematician who's going to talk about philosophy, what I've decided to do tonight is I want to talk about geometry, but I want to talk about it in the vocabulary of philosophy, because that would have been the way Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and even Pythagoras would have described geometry. They would have described it in the terminology of philosophy, because after all, that's what they were teaching in their classes. So let's start again with numbers, and then we'll move on to geometry. Next slide, please. So Plato obviously would have understood and used terms like 1 and 2 if he was talking about there being 1 sheep or 2 sheep. But he also would have understood just as easily what I call the vocabulary of philosophy, geometry and the vocabulary of philosophy, with the idea that there is a oneness, my term, but a philosophical term, a oneness to a single sheep, and a two-ness to 2 sheep. Now, oneness, philosophically, for Plato and Pythagoras, has philosophical overtones in concepts like singularity, unity, and uniqueness. Two-ness would have philosophical overtones like duality, or the power of multiplicity, the representation of a line, two-ness. Now, we rarely think of numbers in this way, but we do have a few fragments of this number vocabulary of philosophy that we still use in our daily life. Next slide, please. This is from Christianity, but it's a fairly universal concept in modern philosophy. It's from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verse 8. And the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Now, my Sunday school teacher, who's a wonderful woman, would probably have said that this was meant metaphorically, but that is simply not true. This is a statement about numbers in the language of philosophy. And all ancient philosophers, all teachers of all ancient mystery schools would have understood this. Everybody good with that? Can we see that? And the oneness and the two-ness shall become a oneness in marriage. The idea that it's not about numbers in the vocabulary of numbers. It's about numbers in the vocabulary of philosophy. So we need to figure out if we're going to shed our ignorance and be allowed into the academy. We've got to shed thousands of years of mathematics and algebra, etc., and we have to hear geometry in the language of philosophy. When we do that, then we will see that geometry, in fact, does draw the mind toward the truth, and it creates a spirit of philosophy. All right, let's try some geometry. Next slide, please. So here's another example of geometry in the language of philosophy. We call this a right triangle. The British would call it a right angle triangle. But the Greeks called this an upright angle and used the same root word for upright angle as the words righteous and righteousness. So there is an uprightness, if you will, philosophical overtone to the concept of a 90-degree angle. Just like we had oneness and two-ness, now we've got 90-degreeness or rightness, uprightness, excuse me, in an angle. Because that's the way Plato, Pythagoras, etc. would have thought about it. Let's look at another one. Next one, please. Now, I don't know if we've just lost words for other angles or if they never really had them, but this is the equilateral triangle. All three sides are the same, all three angles are the same. One of the most sacred symbols of the Pythagorean mystery schools, and you see this both in this configuration and with the point down in all kinds of ancient languages and symbology all over the place. For the Freemasons in the room, we'll step back just for a second and talk about the fact that we still use 60 degrees and 90 degrees with a different philosophical overtone to them in our current ritual. The master of the lodge wears a square as his symbol, uprightness, a right angle, where the past master wears a compass in the configuration of a 60-degree angle. And so there is a philosophical overtone that we still carry in our symbology that came forward from that time. So 60-degreeness, that's a little cumbersome to say, but again, a philosophical overtone. Now the next progression in this would be if we started looking at Platonic solids and the philosophical overtones of a decahedronous, of a 12-faced solid. But at that point in time, we're actually just kind of being nerdy, and I think we're moving farther down the path than we need to go. But I suspect there is, to a certain degree, some of that still related in that symbolism, or that language, philosophical language. Next slide, please. Here's another important aspect of geometry in the language, in the vocabulary of philosophy. The overtones of these numbers in geometry are progressive. And if you look at Plato, the world is understood as a hierarchy in which the more simple and intellectual at the top is prior to and expands the existence and characteristics of the more complex and physical as you move toward the bottom. So, a oneness, a point, unity, deity, two-ness, a line, duality, multiplicity, threeness. We now move to a surface. We're starting the transition into the tangible. And a fourness becomes a shape, nature, materialization. Now we still have this, again, on the Freemason side, we still have this in our lecture on the second degree, but it's almost a throwaway line, that a point becomes a line, becomes a surface, becomes a shape. But that is a fundamental key portion of Plato's philosophy, and certainly would have been part of what he would have expected us to understand in order not to be ignorant and allowed the opportunity to enter the academy. Next slide, please. All right, so let's circle back at this point. Remember, Plato would have had no understanding of numbers or geometry in any of the modern vocabulary that we use. He and his students would have used a vocabulary completely related to philosophy to describe their geometry. That probably would also, I think you can make the same statement about other sciences that they had at the time. You would have had music in a vocabulary of philosophy because you didn't have a musical scale. You would have had astronomy in a vocabulary, a philosophical vocabulary, because you didn't understand the geometry of orbits, you didn't understand waves of light. So, what can this teach us about philosophy and modern sacred geometry? Next slide, please. Well, I guess the first thing we need to do is we need to come up with a definition of modern sacred geometry. So first of all, we've got geometry, the noun, measure of land or earth, and the adjective sacred, hallowed, consecrated, or made holy by association with divinity or divine things or religious ceremony or sanction. So you could say that sacred geometry then is the hallowed way to measure land or earth, not necessarily very interesting or helpful, or the divine act of measuring a space. Yeah, maybe that's a little bit better. Next slide. Often what we see in philosophical writings about sacred geometry is that sacred geometry is a philosophy of proportion and progression. And I think you see here where we're starting to pick up some of the basic ideas that Plato had and bring them into modern sacred geometry. Next slide, please. Okay, we're now going to move out of the geometry world and into the philosophy world. Now you've got to start picking up and helping out here a little bit, okay? So I just started with this. This is one of the very fundamental symbols. This is a very ancient symbol. In modern sacred geometry, this is usually referred to as the seed of life. It's 7 circles, 6 on the outside, 1 on the inside, all overlapping each other. So if Plato says that geometry will draw the mind toward truth and create a spirit of philosophy, does this symbol in fact do that? Does anybody see how this symbol draws them toward the truth or builds a spirit of philosophy? Philosophy majors, stand up, make yourself proud. Does it? Yes? No? A little bit of head shaking? Guys need to be helping out here a little bit. Okay, that's not too bad. How about the next slide? This is where we now pull it into architecture. This is Islamic architecture, but you can see the seed of life being kind of a basic or one of the most basic forms of a mandala. Thank you. Of a mandala. So when you see something like this, does this bring out a spirit of philosophy in you? Does being in the presence of this, if you were standing in the middle of this Islamic temple, would it draw you toward the truth? Is there a spirit of philosophy in here? Peter, you're shaking your head, yes? Can you add something to that?
Well, it does. Progression is what I happen to, and which to me can suggest transformation, which is pretty divine.
Okay.
It draws you towards the top, towards the center too. So that's the feeling. It's kind of what I feel, what I get from looking at this kind of way. It draws you up, draws you to the top, to maybe higher aspirations.
Okay.
Having actually walked into that mosque, and I've had an awful lot of travel opportunity. You cannot help but when you walk in, that's the first thing you do because everything is drawing you up towards that center, and it's. I mean, from a village, it is. You're drawn upward. You're drawn into that idea of there's a unity that you react to it viscerally. You all of a sudden you're looking up and you don't even realize that action has happened. The arches do the same thing. Everything is drawing your eyes upward.
So is it is it just the architecture, or is it the
It's not just the architecture. I mean, the architecture is part of it, but specifically that decoration, if you look again, that progression, I've always thought of it as, Spokes on a wheel, there's all these different ideas, but eventually they're converging on some universal truths, and that's a physical representation of that philosophy of that there are some universal truths, but you're coming at it from all sorts of different angles, but ultimately, that's what we're all trying to reach.
Yep.
I would say that you definitely see the progression where you see several points within that, and then several lines within that, and then several surfaces within that. Then ultimately what that is leading you towards is seeing that all of those things are interconnected, which ultimately is truth.
Right.
That things are interconnected. So that's what I'm getting from it, at least.
So we're all in agreement, proportion and progression, sacred geometry? Okay.
Well, it's similar to the seed of life too, because you have these different circles that are being put together in a very specific way, and it does illustrate some facts about how circles work geometrically. But also, you have them all together, and they make this over sort of rosettes. The 4 petals in the middle, or the 6 petals in the middle, which I think are the best capaces too.
That's another good example.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I think it's interesting that it's like a lot of these things coming together to make something new.
Okay, let's try another one. Next slide, please. So this is our Fibonacci sequence, our golden ratio. Again, looking at it at this perspective. Is it drawing our mind toward truth? Creating a spirit of philosophy? Have any of you ever drawn one of these? Actually gone through the process using a straight edge and I think there's something in doing that you don't get from just at looking at it. But when you start the process of, you start with a square and then you run your compass around and then you double, keep it going, then you get 2, you keep it going, you get 3. When you go through the process of doing that, I think it gives you a little better perspective than just seeing it on the page. So again, let's go to the next slide. So here's some examples from nature. We'll look at this one just to start with. So we've got the measure of space, our proportion, and we've got progression. And so I would say this is an example of sacred geometry. Does anybody else feel this draw them toward the truth? Give you a spirit of philosophy when you look at that. I thought this one was interesting. I'd actually never really considered this one before. But it's amazing. It's out there all over the place.
All these things are living things. So I feel like it's telling us something about life in general.
Yeah. And there you go. Truth, philosophy, life in general. Plato would have expected an understanding of this kind of thing. All right, let's do the next one. Oh, actually, hit it one more time. Yeah, see, it's Santa now, so we're not body shaming anybody. I was just originally going to throw this in for the laugh, but then I thought to myself, well, sacred geometry? Yes or no?
It's interesting that it's terminating at the root chakra.
Yeah. It exists in a number of places.
I've heard it said that the same ratio shows up in structure and face.
Yep. Structures of face, arms, this part versus this. That golden ratio exists all over. Da Vinci's drawings. all over the place. And we could have picked up, pardon me?
Psychedelic experiences?
Yeah. All right, next slide. So here's a little bit different example. Sacred geometry or not? Yeah? Besides just nodding your head? A comment? Yeah.
It's another living thing, right? So it just proves that even the divine seems to be in tune with geometry, right? If the divine is creation of all things, or if a creator is divine, well, there you go.
Okay.
But it also has a notion of geometry, which then makes you ponder the divine, which is a journey towards truth for some.
Yeah. Certainly would have been
I also feel like there's a connectedness.
connectedness. Yep.
Like everybody and everything is connected.
Yeah, because this kind of goes back to, the idea of the way that we pack in circles. And this kind of goes back to the idea of the rosette, the seed of life, the idea of 6 circles being arranged around one center.
Yep. Now you've reacted better when we've shown pictures of sacred geometry in nature versus just a straight drawing of this. I didn't include this slide, but let's assume I had just put a piece of graph paper up here. And instead of being hexagons, they were obviously squares. Sacred geometry?
I would have thought that, but then we're talking about it, I do think it is. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about time and space, right?
Yeah, I think so. Peter?
If you would have put the circles that make the squares on the graph paper, then yes.
Yeah, okay.
I've always thought that there's something magic about, like, if you don't have a measuring device, like a protractor, that in order to make polygons of whatever uniform type that are like squares and stuff, that you have to use circles to make that.
Right. That, and that's, of course, the way,
That's like magic, too.
that's the Euclidean geometry, that's the geometry of straight edges and compasses, and that you can make all of the basic shapes, you can come up with all the basic angles, and you do all of that without measuring. It's all done with circles. Yep. Well, I would agree, graph paper, sacred geometry, but there's, I guess, degrees to this and how much it truly speaks to you. And depending on, for Linda, my wife who made the comment, this probably may have been a stronger pull than some of the other examples from nature because this is what she likes. And you've personally been in that mosque, and so that has a personal connection to you. It's not universal. It's not the same. It's not the same pull for every example that we give. Next slide, please. This is from Facebook. I hate to admit to anything, on a sacred geometry page, and the author who built this walk in their, I guess, backyard was quite impressed with their understanding of sacred geometry. Is it speaking to anybody? Proportion? Yeah, kinda. Progression? No. I don't think so.
It looks really random. It's amazing, Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No. Nothing wrong with this. It's
Well, it seems like a mishmash, right? There's like some things that are deliberate, right? Like you look at the 4 bricks that are each set up, so they're, the steps are exactly halfway, right? And so those 4 bricks at the bottom, you get the rosette, I guess, near the top of that picture, the uniform one. The other rosette with just sort of random rocks kind of feels like, they fit, as opposed to, clearly everything's deliberately placed, but, it's
well, if
pretty.
it's pretty, but if I said This is not sacred geometry. Does anybody want to argue with me?
Probably whoever built that.
Well,
No, but it's
Thank
it
you.
works though. I'll put it this way. It does work. It does, like everything does fit to some extent. And to that, maybe there is progression in that. Maybe there is something sacred in that. That it does achieve the artist / broad mason / landscaper's goal.
right,
Yeah, there's
right. And architecture is obviously full of lots of examples of fine architecture, but not sacred, not following sacred geometry. Art, music, there's all kinds of examples of things that are beautiful and well designed and nice, but that doesn't make them sacred geometry. Next slide. So we could go on and on with our examples, but I think you get the idea. So let me give you an example of recognizing sacred geometry within us. Yesterday, my wife and I were having a conversation about mandalas, and she commented on the fact that since she was a little girl, she's been pulled into drawing mandalas, right? And that has been part of her as long as she can remember. Now, I love her very much. There is nothing geometry about my wife. But there is something and an understanding and a connection to sacred geometry within my wife. And in her particular case, it was the pull to the mandalas, the pull to the bees and the honeycomb. So regardless of how you define sacred or sacred geometry, Pythagoras and Plato would have claimed that geometry was included in all of us at our creation. But they didn't mean trigonometry. They meant this philosophy, this geometry in the vocabulary of philosophy. That's what they meant when they said that we were created with geometry within us. Now, for the Freemasons in the group, if you go back to Anderson's First Masonic Constitution, he makes almost the same claim. He claims that the original Adam and Eve had geometry placed within them at the time of creation, and therefore all of us have that within us. Again, it's the geometry that's related to this vocabulary of philosophy that is in all of us. So whether we use the term geometry, as Plato and Pythagoras would have used, or whether we use the term sacred geometry, or whether we use the philosophical idea of proportion and progression, I think it is, and I think we've, at least to a certain degree, proved tonight, that it does exist in all of us to a certain degree, because when we see it, we recognize it. It does, as Plato indicates, truly reach in and touch us, give us moves us in the direction of truth, and creates within us the spirit of philosophy. One last example, one more slide, and we'll close and take questions or comments or whatnot. I am not nearly good enough at the Kabbalah to work on this beyond this, but here is our tree of life. You see squares and triangles and circles, and it all connects up together. And that would be a great lecture for somebody who's a lot smarter at that than I am. But I think that is a nice place to end. Any comments or questions from the group about philosophy and sacred geometry? Yep.
So one thing that occurred to me was you mentioned the sacredness of measuring a space, right? And something clicked in my head, because in Revelation, talks very in depth about the measurements of what the new heaven is going to look like. And I always kind of, I'm reading Revelation. You've got, the stars falling from the sky, this, that, and all the, the catastrophes of Armageddon and such. Why is so much time being spent on measuring this heavenly edifice? And now I got to go back and read it, because that might have something to do with the sacredness of measuring the space, like you say, and that might go back to, like the original, the idea of geometry that's within us is, beings who are trying to understand ourselves and the world and to measure things in that way.
Exactly, and I would suggest, and all of you have probably done that, most of you I think have been upstairs and you've been into the lodge room. The lodge room feels right. And it partially feels right because its length and its width are related to the golden ratio. Whereas this room, as nice as this room is, doesn't feel right. It doesn't have a sacredness to it. There is a lot of importance in measuring. Altars are the same way. You don't just arbitrarily decide how big an altar is. You use the golden ratio, or you use this idea of taking a square and putting it in half. So half a square and this ratio feels right for sacred things. And I think we can tell the difference. I can tell the difference when I walk into a room, or you walk into a church, you walk into a sacred space. If it's done correctly, it feels right. Now, that's not to say that there's a nice church not too far from our home that's basically built as theater in the round, right? You can sit almost all the way around and whatnot. That's fine. It's nice. It's a nice church. It's a nice space. But to me, it doesn't feel sacred. It doesn't have that same feel to it because it's not proportionally correct. Yeah.
Your presentation is really reminding me of a line from one of our rituals, and that's God's hieroglyphics are illustrated in the book of nature. I think it's a perfect illustration of sacred geometry.
And we could pick, and I'm sure all of you have. You've seen lots and lots and lots of pictures of sacred geometry projected upon things in nature. It just seems to work that way. It works better. Nature works better when it follows these proportions and progressions that are built in us by divinity. We were given this at the time of creation, as was everything, or we wouldn't see it all over the place. Yeah.
This whole presentation was phenomenal. It was really good, really mind-expanding for me, but it made me think of a quote from one of my favorite mathematicians, geometricians, Benoit Mandelbrot, who said, "My life seemed to be a series of events and accidents, yet when I look back, I see a pattern." And I think that life being a progression in itself and looking back at it, that there is a system to it. And depending on how you think about life, but life is a pretty amazing journey. To think that there's a pattern to it almost leads you to believe that there's a geometry to your life, if you will. So that's what this made me think of, is just like, what parts of my life are sacredly geometrical, I guess, so, for lack of a better term, yeah.
I think, we all have good times and bad times. And, when things are proportional and they're progressive, we feel good and life seems to be going good and it works out pretty good. And when it's out of whack, it doesn't. And again, I think, and if Plato was sitting here, he'd be sitting in the front row going, duh, everybody ought to know that. And I think we all do, but we've forgotten it because we've added all of this modern arithmetic, trigonometry, all of that stuff, but we've added all of that, and so we've lost the idea of geometry that they had. Dan, you and I were talking earlier today about the randomness in the universe, and there is a lot of randomness in the universe, but I think it works best when it is truly progressive, when it works better that way.
But what you talked about with Adam and Eve, that progression of numbers inherently is part of the way that we understand and think of the world. So like I find a colloquial example. A two-legged stool won't stand up. And that just tells us a whole lot about the world and the way it goes together and how things are.
Yeah, that whole, you know, point to a line, to a shape, to a solid is, for me, I guess to a certain degree where I kind of got into the idea of this, because I would have been much happier standing up here and giving you the nerdy, you know, geometry lecture, because I'm a lot more comfortable with that than I am the philosophy part of this. But that was part of it that really spoke to me. That when you look at that and you look at Plato's idea of hierarchies and levels of understanding and meeting, oh, I get it. I see how that works. And that was the eye-opener for me. But anybody else? I guess that's it. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.